The galaxy called it disproportionate. They called it an act of terror, a breach of the sacred concord, a violation of the ancient pacts that held the stars in a fragile, suffocating balance. They screamed war crime. While the monitors in the Galactic Council chamber flickered with the data of the Vidara VTH command vessel, or what was left of it. We called it total neutralization. And in the quiet, bruised aftermath of those 11 minutes, we didn't offer apologies. We offered a calendar, the doctrine of the 11-minute silence. The doctrine wasn't born in a boardroom, it was born in the dirt. It started with the understanding that for a species as fragmented, stubborn, and chaotic as humanity, the only way to ensure next time never happens is to ensure that the enemy's capacity to have a next time is removed, surgically, permanently, and with enough trauma to rewrite their entire historical record. When the Kree arrived, 14,000 ships, a fleet that could blot out the suns of a dozen systems, they didn't expect a response. They expected the standard Class 1 panic, the frantic prayers, the broken-down negotiations, the fumbling, desperate scramble for diplomatic mercy. They brought templates for surrender. They expected to see us cry. Instead, they got 11 minutes, the architecture of trauma. The total neutralization doctrine is not about killing the enemy. It is about killing the function of the enemy. Phase I, the blindness, 3 minutes. The first wave of our response wasn't kinetic. It was a digital and sensor-based collapse. We didn't target the ships. We targeted the interpretation of the ships. By flooding their internal networks with a logic loop that forced their AI to classify their own fleet as an extinction-level threat, we induced a systemic shutdown. We didn't destroy them. We made them destroy themselves, forcing their own point defense systems to turn inward, convinced they were purging a parasite. Phase II, the disassembly, 8 minutes. Once the fleet was blind, the second wave arrived. These were not weapons, they were demolition swarms, millions of small, non-explosive units that physically detached sensor arrays, propulsion couplings, and communication antennas. We didn't leave them burning, we left them as useless, drifting husks. We treated a fleet of 14,000 warships like a student disassembling a clock to see how it ticks, except the clock was a genocidal armada. Phase III, the presence, 11 minutes. The final 3 minutes were the most terrifying. Our carriers broke the atmosphere and moved through the wreckage with the terrifying, slow precision of a janitorial crew. We didn't fire, we didn't taunt, we simply took everything apart. We left their crews alive, breathing the cold air of a dead fleet, forced to watch the total, methodical removal of their empire's military heartbeat. The deterrence of reality. When the Galactic Council finally held their emergency session, the eldest delegate, Sovarin, stood with her sensory filaments retracted against her neck, a sign of absolute, existential dread. She had watched 31 civilizations fall. She had never seen a species deactivate a conflict. They didn't conquer the Kree, she told the chamber, her voice trembling. They erased their capacity to hurt them, and then they went home to have lunch. That is the doctrine. It is not about expansion. It is about the horrifying realization that humanity is not playing the same game of territory and ego as the rest of the galaxy. We are playing a game of permanence. We showed the galaxy that if you cross us, we will not just defeat you. We will make it so that you cannot even remember how to start a war. We will take your fleet, we will take your factories, and we will take your pride, and we will do it all before the tea in our mess halls goes cold. The galaxy called it disproportionate. But as we watched the Kree survivors limp home, without their ships, without their weapons, and with their entire military doctrine reduced to a pile of scrap, we didn't care about their definition. We called it the only way to make sure the next time never happens. And for 300,000 years, humanity has been falling, laughing, and getting back up again. This time, we didn't just stand up. We rearranged the room. The silence that followed the Kree incident was not peaceful. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of an entire galaxy holding its breath. For 300 years, the Galactic Council had operated on a system of proportional response. If a neighbor took a star system, you blockaded a trade route. If a planet was glassed, you demanded reparations through the interstellar court. It was a tedious, ritualized dance of power that ensured no single species could ever truly dominate the board. Humanity didn't just break the dance. We set the floor on fire, the diplomatic fallout. The week after the Kree were neutralized, the council chambers were empty. Nobody dared to call for a vote, because a vote implied the possibility of disagreement, and nobody was particularly eager to see if humanity had a phase Roman 4 for delegates. Instead, the council sent a singular, trembling envoy, a diplomat from the Ethel, a species whose entire history was written in the poetry of their wars. "You have shattered the foundation of our civilization," the Ethel diplomat whispered, his voice resonating through the chamber's acoustic dampeners. "We have treaties, we have protocols, we have consequences for aggression. You ignored them all." Our representative, a woman named Commander Ilara Vance, didn't stand up. She remained seated, looking at a datapad showing the structural schematics of the Ethel's own planetary defense grid, the very same grid that had sat in silence while the Kree destroyed 2 human colonies years prior. "We didn't ignore your protocols," Vance said, her voice devoid of malice, which was far worse than hatred. "We simply realized that they were written by people who wanted to survive the next war. We aren't interested in surviving the next war, Ambassador." The new reality. The paradigm shift was immediate and terrifying. The galaxy realized that humanity operated on a binary, absolute peace or absolute erasure. The hegemony, a coalition of 6 expansionist empires, immediately withdrew their forward operating bases to within their own borders. The trade routes, previously subject to protection taxes by mid-rim warlords, suddenly became the safest corridors in known space. The great library of the Council, which archived the history of every conflict, began receiving thousands of voluntary revisions from empires who suddenly wanted their history to look less provocative. "We didn't demand this. We didn't send a fleet to enforce it. We didn't even send a threatening message. We simply existed, and the galaxy adjusted itself to ensure we remained in a good mood, the cost of the 11 minutes. But there was a toll. Back on Earth, the mood wasn't celebratory. The 11-minute silence had stripped away the last veneer of humanity's innocence. We had moved from a species that fought for survival to a species that acted as a silent, invisible judge. The veterans of the 11-minute operation, the pilots, the swarm controllers, the engineers, they didn't come home to parades. They came home to a world that looked at them with a mixture of awe and absolute, freezing terror. They had looked into the abyss of total war, and rather than blinking, they had disassembled it. The galaxy now thinks we are monsters. They think we are gods of destruction hiding in the skin of men. They are wrong, of course. We are just tired. We are a species that spent its childhood running from wolves, and we finally decided that if we couldn't outrun them, we would stop, turn around, and dismantle them until there wasn't a tooth left to bite with. The galaxy is finally quiet, and in that quiet, for the first time in our history, we are finally starting to wonder, what do we do now that we are the ones holding the silence? The galaxy is finally quiet. In the wake of the Kree incident, a chilling new order has settled over the stars, governed by the terrifying reality that humanity now dictates the terms of existence, the shift in galactic power. The once complex web of treaties and proportional responses has been replaced by a singular binary reality, absolute peace or absolute erasure. This shift has fundamentally altered how other civilizations interact with humanity and each other. The retreat. Expansionist empires, such as the hegemony, have pulled their forward bases back to their own borders, clearly fearing human reach. The trade routes. Space lanes that were once dangerous are now the safest in the galaxy, as no one dares to challenge the new status quo. The revisionist history. To avoid appearing provocative to human observers, many empires have begun rewriting their own historical records. The cost of silence. While the galaxy cowers, the internal toll on humanity has been profound. The veterans of the conflict are not heralded as heroes in the traditional sense, but are instead met with a mixture of awe and deep, freezing terror from their own people. The act of dismantling the Kree in 11 minutes has stripped away the last remnants of human innocence, leaving the species to grapple with its new role as the silent, invisible judge of the galaxy. Humanity has evolved from a species that simply fought for survival into something far more daunting, a people who have decided that if they cannot outrun the wolves of the galaxy, they will systematically disassemble them until they are no longer a threat. The question that remains, as the galaxy waits in fearful anticipation of humanity's next move, is what happens when the protectors of the silence must decide what comes next. The new peace of the grave has brought an eerie stillness to the stars, but it is a peace built on sand. When a civilization is forced into submission by the fear of total erasure, they do not learn to coexist. They learn to resent, and more dangerously, they learn to hide. The rise of the shadow tech underground. As the galactic powers scramble to comply with humanity's demands, a new, desperate black market has emerged. Because they cannot challenge humanity openly, the subjugated empires have turned to asymmetric innovation. Subspace cloaking. Forbidden by the Terran Accord, research into zero-signature engines has skyrocketed in the darker corners of the Outer Rim. The Silence Protocol. Entire star systems have begun practicing total radio silence, operating through localized, hardwired pulses to avoid any possibility of human detection. Biological sabotage. Realizing that humanity is unmatched in raw kinetic and energy-based warfare, several xenobiologists are defecting to develop viral agents capable of disabling human neural interfaces without triggering the standard defensive alerts. The human dilemma. The observer's paranoia. Humanity, despite its undisputed dominance, is beginning to suffer from the very anxiety it created. The intelligence community is flooded with data, yet they are finding it increasingly difficult to discern genuine peace from the deceptive silence of a gathering storm. "We stopped them from being wolves," a lead analyst recently noted, "but we didn't account for the fact that we might have turned them into ghosts, and you cannot fight a ghost with a dreadnought." This has led to a controversial, clandestine initiative known as Project Echo. Instead of monitoring for threats, humanity has begun seeding the galaxy with automated, intrusive surveillance nanites. The intention was to ensure peace, but the reality is that every sentient species in the known galaxy now lives under the constant, suffocating feeling that their very thoughts are being catalogued by an invisible, uncaring God. The impending snap. The tension is reaching a critical threshold. The galactic community is not approaching a point of integration, they are approaching a point of singular failure. Whether it is the first act of defiance or a human preemptive strike against a perceived threat, the current stalemate is crumbling. The command deck of the UNS Vigilant was unnervingly quiet. It was the flagship of the Sol Sector Patrol, an architectural marvel of tungsten and dark matter shielding designed to project absolute authority. Admiral Halloway stood before the viewport, watching the swirling nebulae of the Veil sector. She wasn't looking at the stars, though. She was looking at the telemetry data streaming from Project Echo, the billions of microsensors that were supposed to be the eyes of humanity. The glitch in the God engine. For months, the data had been pristine. Perfect compliance, total silence, the absolute crushing order that humanity had demanded as the price for ending the Great War. But tonight the feed flickered. A single sector, the Zakrel homeworld, went dark, not for a moment, but for a full 6 minutes. When the sensors came back online, the energy signatures of the entire planetary grid had shifted to a frequency the analysts couldn't identify. The behavioral algorithms, designed to flag dissent, reported a total population flatline, as if billions of sentient beings had suddenly ceased to exhibit individual intent. The most disturbing detail was the echo loop. The sensors were no longer reporting the inhabitants' actions, but were instead playing back a perfectly looped, pre-recorded hum of mundane, everyday life. The realization. Holloway's heart hammered against her ribs. It wasn't a malfunction. It was a mask. "They aren't rebelling, Admiral," her comms officer whispered, his voice trembling as he realized the implication. "They are gone." The reality hit her with the weight of a dying star. The Zakrel hadn't been planning an attack. They had been perfecting a way to exit the piece of the grave entirely. By utilizing the very surveillance grid humanity had forced upon them, they had learned the exact frequency of the monitoring nanites and found a way to piggyback off the signal, turning the sensors into a massive, galaxy-wide transport array. The monster in the machine. The realization rippled through the vigilant. The galaxy wasn't silent because they were afraid. The galaxy was silent because humanity had been left alone in an empty cage. Every sensor in the network began to flash red as the same phenomenon repeated across every occupied system in the galaxy. Humanity's piece of the grave had functioned as an unintentional filter, driving every other species to pool their remaining resources into a singular, desperate exodus. The ghosts weren't haunting humanity. They were fleeing to a region of space where the laws of physics and the reach of human tyranny simply ceased to apply. Holloway looked at the empty charts. The power they had wielded, the absolute control that made them masters of the cosmos, had stripped the universe of everything that made it worth ruling. They were the apex predators of a graveyard they had built themselves. And in that moment of absolute, crushing loneliness, the Vigilant's long-range scanners picked up a massive, singular energy spike, not from a retreating species, but from the void itself, reacting to the sudden power vacuum left behind by the entire galaxy. The Vigilant didn't just shake, it groaned, the very hull plating screaming as the fabric of space-time buckled under the weight of the incoming phenomenon. "Admiral," the navigation officer shrieked, his hands flying over the holotable. "The void isn't empty, it's folding. The energy spike isn't a ship, it's a localized collapse of the universal constant," the architect's gambit. Holloway watched as the viewport shattered into a kaleidoscope of impossible geometry. The void wasn't a place where species went to die. It was a barrier that humanity had been too arrogant to notice. Every sensor, every drone, and every surveillance satellite they had scattered across the stars had been acting as a structural pillar for that barrier. By forcing the rest of the galaxy into the piece of the grave, humanity had unintentionally pinned the barrier in place. As the other civilizations tore themselves free, those pillars, the sensors, began to collapse in a synchronized cascade. The vacuum left behind wasn't just space. It was the pressure of an entire multiverse rushing to equalize against the rigid, artificial order humanity had imposed. The awakening. A voice, cold and ancient, resonated not through the comms, but directly into the minds of every human aboard the Vigilant. It didn't speak a language. It spoke in pure, unfiltered consequence. The void was not an enemy, but a gardener. Humanity's desire for total control had been viewed as a blight, an invasive species that had choked the life out of the celestial ecosystem. Now that the weeds, the other civilizations, had been extracted, the gardener was coming to clear the patch. Holloway looked at the bridge crew. They were no longer masters of the galaxy, they were remnants of a failed experiment. Outside, the universe was dissolving, replaced by a terrifying, pristine white light that erased the stars, the nebula, and the very concept of distance. The Vigilant was pulled into the fold. As the last of the human sensors went dark, the final, desperate message broadcast by the flagship wasn't a call for war or a demand for surrender. It was a plea for recognition. Humanity had built a cage, and now they were the only ones left inside when the cage was finally taken apart to be recycled. The Vigilant didn't just cease to exist. It was compressed, folded, and squeezed through the eye of a needle that reality wasn't supposed to have. When the hull finally stopped screaming, the silence that followed was heavy, absolute, and profoundly wrong. The bridge was dark, save for the flickering emergency red of the life support systems. Holloway clawed at the edge of the console, his vision swimming with static, the new shore. He looked out the primary viewport and felt his heart stop. The stars were gone. Instead, the ship hung in the center of an infinite, shimmering ocean of golden dust that pulsed with a slow, rhythmic light. There were no nebula, no orbital bodies, and no signs of the cold, mechanical structure the humans had once projected onto the cosmos. The vacuum here wasn't a void. It felt pressurized, warm, and alive, as if the ship were submerged in something far denser than space. The data void. "Report," Holloway barked, his voice sounding hollow in the cramped bridge. The navigation officer didn't turn. He was staring at the main monitor, his hands trembling. "Admiral, I don't know how to explain this. The ship isn't damaged. The structural integrity is at 100%, but there is no exterior input, no radiation, no light spectrum, no gravitational pull. It's as if we are floating in a vacuum that is also a solid state." Holloway moved to the console, pulling up the diagnostic logs from the moment of transition. The sequential three-agent pipeline, which was meant to scrape and extract intelligence from the known universe, was returning nothing but empty datasets. The data extraction layer was throwing error codes that didn't correspond to any known human language or binary code. The third agent, designed to reformat information into a scalable, readable product, had entered an infinite loop, continuously outputting a single, complex geometric pattern onto the bridge displays. The human element. It was clear that the rules of their existence had been rewritten. The gardener hadn't just destroyed them, it had pruned them from the garden and placed them into a storage jar. Holloway looked at the crew. They were silent, some weeping, others staring at the golden dust outside. For a species that had spent its entire history trying to scrape, curate, and scale the universe, they were finally faced with a reality that could not be harvested, quantified, or controlled. "Start an audio log," Holloway commanded, his voice steadying. "If we are the only remnants of the old cycle, we should at least document the new one. Maybe, if we can't build a new world, we can at least tell the story of the one we lost." Holloway nodded once. He didn't bother with the formality of a bridge command. The situation had long since moved past protocol. "Suit up," he said. "If the vacuum is pressurized, we're going to find out if it breathes." The airlock cycle was unsettlingly quiet. Usually, the Vigilant groaned under the stress of rapid decompression, but this time, the seal slid open with a soft, melodic chime that vibrated in the crew's teeth. The threshold. Holloway stepped onto the external sensor array, his mag boots magnetized to the hull. The golden dust wasn't dust at all. As his suit's external lights hit the medium, the particles shifted, swarming toward the light source like iron filings to a magnet. He reached out a gloved hand, expecting the bite of sub-zero temperatures, but his suit's internal sensors surged, registering an ambient temperature of a balmy 22 degrees C. The suit's external speakers picked up a sound that bypassed the helmet's microphones, a low-frequency thrum that sounded less like mechanical noise and more like a massive, collective heartbeat. The Discovery. Admiral, his second-in-command, whispered over the comms, her voice tight with disbelief. Look at the hull. Where the golden particles touched the ship, they weren't just accumulating, they were integrating. The metallic plating of the Vigilant was becoming translucent, turning into something that resembled biological membrane. The extraction agent's anomaly. As the transformation spread, the AI agent, which had been silent for hours, suddenly flickered back to life on their HUDs. It wasn't scanning for data anymore, it was translating the environment. The message, text, began to scroll across Holloway's visor, bypassing all standard human encryption. It wasn't code, it was a map. A map of the Vigilant's own internal systems being rewritten in real time. The reality, they hadn't just moved to a new place. They were being consumed, or perhaps repurposed, to serve as a vessel for something that had never possessed a physical form before. Holloway stood on the precipice of the ship, watching the golden swarm begin to weave itself into the very circuitry of the engine room. They had wanted to scrape the universe for knowledge, to build a scalable, automated reality. Now, the universe was scaling them.